How to conquer 3 continents, command the world's most feared legions, enforce an entire empire to call you the Great before you even turn 30, only to end up as a headless corpse on a nameless beach. In the chaotic, blood-soaked twilight of the Roman Republic, a volatile and terrifying era when the venerable constitution was crumbling under the crushing weight of unbridled ambition, and sacred laws were increasingly treated as mere suggestions by power-hungry warlords, Gnaeus Pompeius made a fateful, audacious decision that would shatter centuries of aristocratic tradition and irrevocably define the trajectory of his entire life. At the tender, inexperienced age of 23, an age when most aspiring Roman aristocrats were quietly serving humble apprenticeships in the Forum, learning the ropes of rhetoric or managing minor administrative duties to build their resumes, step by step, Pompey brazenly bypassed the established cursus honorum entirely. He chose a path of blood over bureaucracy, deciding to inherit a legion rather than earn a vote. He was not a self-made man in the traditional Republican sense, but rather the inheritor of a fierce private loyalty cultivated by his father Pompey Strabo, a man known as the Roman Butcher, despised by the Senate for his cruelty and avarice to such an extent that upon his death, the mob dragged his corpse through the mud of the streets. Yet, despite this dark legacy, he was worshipped by his soldiers in the rural, rugged district of Picenum. When the exiled warlord Lucius Cornelius Sulla marched on Rome to reclaim power from the Marian faction, plunging the Italian peninsula into a vicious, fratricidal civil war, Pompey did not wait for authorization from a paralyzed Senate. Instead, he rode into the villages of Picenum and, re-invoking his father's name, raised 3 private legions from the retired veterans living on his estates, effectively committing high treason under Roman law. Yet, in this era of civil strife, where authority flowed only from the tip of a gladius, the law was silent amidst the clash of arms. Pompey displayed a terrifying prodigal aptitude for warfare, maneuvering his private army with a tactical ruthlessness that belied his youth. He crushed Sulla's enemies in northern Italy with such brutal efficiency and total lack of mercy, executing captured leaders and sacking resistant towns, that he earned a chilling moniker from his contemporaries, the Agila Essentialis Carnifex, or the Teenage Butcher. He did not seek to climb the slow bureaucratic ladder of power. He built his own staircase out of the bodies of Rome's enemies, proving to a horrified and helpless Senate that in the TSA dying days of the Republic, a young man with a loyal army and a famous name was far more powerful than a duly elected magistrate with a title. Before we continue with the meteoric, controversial, and ultimately tragic rise of Rome's original Golden Boy, a man who conquered 3 continents and redrew the map of the world. Before he had gray hair, take a brief moment to support our channel. Creating in-depth, high-quality historical documentaries like this requires immense research, scripting, and editing effort to bring the ancient world back to life in all its complex glory. So, if you are enjoying this deep dive into the life of Pompey the Great and finding value in our analysis, please hit that like button right now. It truly helps the algorithm share this history with more people around the world. Make sure you are subscribed and have the notification bell turned on so you never miss an episode of our ongoing series on the Titans of Antiquity. And finally, share this video with a friend, a student, or a fellow history enthusiast who needs to understand that the complex deadly. Game of Thrones was played in Rome long before it was ever written in fiction. Now let's return to the battlefield where a young butcher is about to boldly demand a triumph he has not legally earned. The relationship between the aging, terrifying dictator Sulla and his young, ambitious protege was one of the most fascinating psychological dynamics in all of Roman history, characterized by a volatile mixture of genuine utility, mutual fear, and barely concealed sarcasm. After Pompey had swept through the islands of Sicily and the unruly provinces of North Africa, brutally suppressing the remnants of the Marian faction and executing the consul Carbo without a flicker of hesitation or remorse, he returned to Rome, not as a subordinate, but expecting a hero's welcome. Sulla, perhaps attempting to placate the young general's dangerous vanity, or perhaps mocking his unearned grandeur, greeted him with the cognomen, Magnus the Great. It was a title that evoked the legendary Alexander of Macedon, a comparison that seemed almost laughable for a man in his 20s who had never held a formal office, yet Pompey adopted it with a complete lack of irony. Wearing the title like a crown for the rest of his life, demanding to be addressed by it, even by his superiors. Emboldened by this recognition and the fanatical loyalty of his troops, who camped ominously outside the city walls, Pompey pushed his luck to the absolute breaking point by demanding a triumph, the highest, most sacred honor a Roman general could receive. This honor was legally reserved only for praetors or consuls who had won a significant foreign war, not for a private warlord fighting a civil war against fellow citizens. Sulla initially refused, citing the very laws he himself was trying to restore to the Republic. In a moment of breathtaking arrogance that signaled the tectonic shift in power, Pompey famously retorted to the dictator's face that more people worship the rising sun than the setting one. Stunned by the audacity and realizing that Pompey's veterans were loyal only to the young general, Sulla capitulated. He allowed the equestrian Pompey to ride through Rome in a chariot, though the scene descended into absolute farce when Pompey attempted to squeeze through the triumphal gate in a chariot pulled by 4 massive elephants, symbols of his African victories, which ultimately got stuck in the archway, forcing him to humiliatingly climb down and switch to horses, while the crowd looked on in amusement. It was a perfect metaphor for Pompey, grand ambition constantly clashing with the hard, narrow reality of Rome's constraints. However, the intoxicating ease of Pompey's early victories soon collided with the harsh, grinding reality of war against a true military genius. Following Sulla's death, the Senate, desperate for a commander to quell the massive rebellion in Hispania, modern-day Spain, reluctantly sent Pompey to face Quintus Sertorius, a renegade Roman general who had united the native Iberian tribes into a formidable hybrid fighting force. This was not a simple mop-up operation against demoralized rebels. It was a masterclass in humiliation for the young Pompey. Sertorius, a brilliant master of guerrilla warfare and psychological tactics, who kept a white fawn he claimed communicated the will of the goddess Diana to inspire his superstitious troops, refused to fight on Pompey's conventional terms. For years, Sertorius outmaneuvered, ambushed, and battered Pompey's legions in the mountain passes, teaching the teenage butcher that brute force was useless against superior strategy and local knowledge. In one particularly disastrous skirmish near the river Turia, Pompey was even wounded in the thigh and nearly captured, escaping capture only because his enemies paused to loot the gold-encrusted trappings of his abandoned horse, allowing him to crawl to safety. This grueling campaign in the rugged Spanish terrain forced Pompey to mature rapidly. He learned the hard lessons of patience, logistics, and the necessity of attrition over glory. The war dragged on for nearly a decade, bleeding the Roman treasury dry, and straining Pompey's reputation. It was only brought to a close not by Pompey's tactical brilliance, but by treachery within the enemy camp. Sertorius was assassinated at a banquet by his own jealous officer, Perperna. Seizing the opportunity, Pompey immediately crushed the inferior commander, Perperna, executed the conspirators to restore order, and famously burned Sertorius's correspondence unread to prevent further political purges in Rome, a savvy political move. He returned from Hispania not merely as a butcher, but as a hardened, seasoned commander who had stabilized the West, though he conveniently arrived in Italy just in time to steal the credit for crushing the remnants of the Spartacus slave revolt, further inflating his legend at the expense of Crassus. By the late 70s BC, the Roman Republic faced an existential threat that was not an invading army, but a strangulation of its essential supply lines. The Mediterranean Sea, the economic lifeblood of the empire, had been completely overrun by Cilician pirates, who had grown from nuisance raiders into a veritable naval superpower. These pirates were not mere thieves. They operated with impunity, sacking over 400 cities, raiding the port of Ostia itself, destroying the consular fleet in the harbor, kidnapping high-ranking Roman magistrates for ransom, and most critically intercepting the massive grain fleets sailing from Egypt and Sicily. Rome was starving, the price of bread soared to astronomical levels, and the people rioted in the streets, threatening to burn down the Senate House if action wasn't taken. In this atmosphere of panic, the Tribunalus Gabinus proposed a radical controversial law, the Lex Gabinia, granting Pompey unprecedented imperium infinitum, absolute authority over the entire Mediterranean Sea, and 50 miles inland, effectively making him a monarch of the oceans. Despite fierce, apoplectic opposition from the conservative Senate, who feared giving one man so much unchecked power, the starving populace forced the law through. Pompey's response was a demonstration of logistical and organizational genius that has rarely been equaled in military history. Instead of chasing the pirates aimlessly across the open water, he divided the entire Mediterranean into 13 separate grid sectors, assigning a legate and a specific fleet to each. He swept through the sea like a giant dragnet, flushing the pirates out of their hiding spots and driving them relentlessly east toward their strongholds in Cilicia. In an astonishing, miraculous 40 days, he cleared the entire western Mediterranean, restoring the grain supply and saving Rome from famine. He then moved east, crushing the pirate citadels and, in a move of surprising mercy and foresight, resettled the defeated pirates as farmers in depopulated areas rather than crucifying them, turning enemies into productive subjects. He had solved a crippling, decades-long crisis in just 3 months, cementing his status as the indispensable, godlike savior of Rome. With the seas secured and his popularity at its zenith, Pompey's ambition turned toward the fabled wealth and prestige of the East. The war against King Mithridates VI of Pontus, a thorn in Rome's side for a generation, had stalled under the strict but unpopular command of Lucullus. Using his immense political capital, Pompey had his command extended through the Lex Manilia, allowing him to replace Lucullus and take over the war. What followed was less of a traditional war and more of a royal procession of conquest. Pompey drove the aging Mithridates into the wilderness, where the old king eventually took his own life, and then proceeded to redraw the map of the Near East with the absolute authority of an emperor. He annexed Syria as a new Roman province, marched his legions through the mountains of Armenia, and intervened in the vicious civil war in Judea, culminating in a brutal 3-month siege of Jerusalem. In an act that would be remembered with horror by the Jewish people for centuries, Pompey entered the Holy of Holies in the temple, a sacred space reserved only for the high priest once a year, simply to satisfy his curiosity. As he stepped behind the veil, expecting to see a grand idol of gold, he found only emptiness and silence, an abstract monotheism that confused his Roman sensibilities. He left the temple treasury untouched, but his intrusion was a violation that stained his legacy in the region. By the time he was finished, he had established a vast network of client kingdoms loyal to him personally doubled the annual revenue of the Roman state and acquired personal wealth that dwarfed the wildest dreams of the old aristocracy. He was no longer just a general. He was the richest and most powerful man in the known world, operating as a king in all but name, with kings and tetrarchs waiting in his antechamber for an audience begging for his favor. In 62 BC, Pompey Magnus began his slow, deliberate journey back to Italy, and a terrified silence fell over the city of Rome. The Senate and the people alike vividly remembered the return of Sulla. They remembered how a returning general with a loyal, battle-hardened army could icily march on the city, purge his enemies, and install himself as dictator for life. Pompey held the fate of the Republic in the palm of his hand. He had the power, the money, and the swords to become the absolute ruler of Rome if he so wished. Yet, upon landing at the port of Brandisium, Pompey did something that completely confounded his critics and defined his complex, often contradictory character. He voluntarily disbanded his legions. He dismissed his veterans to their homes, keeping only a small ceremonial escort, and entered Rome as a private citizen. It was a gesture of supreme confidence and loyalty to the republican ideals he claimed to uphold. He believed that his immense achievements spoke for themselves, and that the Senate would naturally grant him the land for his veterans and ratify his eastern settlements out of sheer gratitude. This proved to be a catastrophic political miscalculation. Without his army looming over them, the conservative optimates in the Senate, led by men like the stoic Cato the Younger, and the embittered Lucullus, saw no reason to bow to him. They blocked his legislation, delayed his ratifications with endless filibusters, and humiliated the great Pompey at every turn, proving that in the cutthroat world of Roman politics, gratitude was a currency with absolutely no value. The conqueror of the East found himself impotent in the face of bureaucratic obstructionism. Frustrated, marginalized, and furious at the Senate's short-sightedness, Pompey was driven into the arms of unlikely allies. He realized that the current political machinery was broken and that he needed leverage to secure his legacy. In 60 BC, he entered into a secret, off-the-books coalition that would determine the fate of the Western world. He allied himself with Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, and his former rival, and a rising charismatic populace named Julius Caesar. This alliance, known to history as the First Triumvirate, was described by the scholar Varro as a three-headed monster that swallowed the Republic. It was a union of pure cynical pragmatism. Pompey brought the immense military prestige and the voting bloc of his thousands of veterans. Crassus brought the immense financial backing and deep political connections. And Caesar brought the energy, the daring, and the consulship of 59 BC to execute their collective will. Together, they were unstoppable. They bypassed the Senate entirely, using mob violence and legal loopholes to force their agenda through the popular assemblies. Pompey finally got the land settlements for his veterans and the ratification of his Eastern Acts, while Caesar secured a lucrative and extended military command in Gaul to build his own fortune. It was a masterstroke of political engineering that granted Pompey exactly what he desired. But in doing so, he helped dismantle the very constitutional safeguards that protected the Republic, unwittingly empowering the man who would eventually destroy him. To cement this fragile political alliance with a bond of blood, a marriage was arranged that shocked and scandalized Roman high society. Pompey, now in his late 40s, married Caesar's daughter Julia, who was 24 years his junior and previously betrothed to another. The cynics of Rome sneered at the union, dismissing it as a sordid political transaction, a young girl traded like cattle for soldiers and votes. However, history reveals that this marriage defied all cynical expectations. Pompey, the weathered warlord who had spent his life in camps, fell deeply, genuinely, and obsessively in love with his young bride. Ancient sources describe a Pompey who was utterly captivated by Julia's charm, beauty, and wit, to the point where he began to neglect his political duties and the governance of the city to spend time with her in their luxurious country villas. He became a devoted husband, a role that softened his harsh public image and provided him with a period of domestic happiness he had arguably never known. Julia, in turn, proved to be a woman of remarkable grace and political intelligence, acting as the vital, stabilizing glue between the massive, colliding egos of her father and her husband. As long as Julia lived, the bond between Pompey and Caesar held firm. She was the human shield, preventing the inevitable clash between the two most ambitious men in Rome. During these halcyon years, Pompey seemed content to rest on his laurels, enjoying his wealth and his wife, unaware that the foundation of his peace was as fragile as human life itself. The unraveling of the triumvirate and the descent into chaos began with two specific heartbreaking tragedies that shattered the delicate balance of power. In 54 BC, a violent riot broke out at an election in Rome, and Pompey's toga was splashed with the blood of a bystander. When his slaves brought the stained toga home, the pregnant Julia fainted from the shock, fearing her husband had been killed. This trauma induced a miscarriage, and although she recovered briefly, she died in childbirth later that year, taking her infant child, the last genetic link between Caesar and Pompey, with her. The grief of Pompey was profound, and the personal link to Caesar was irrevocably severed. When Caesar offered his great niece Octavia as a replacement bride, Pompey refused, signaling a distinct cooling of their alliance. The second devastating blow came the following year. In 53 BC, when Crassus, desperate to match the military glory of his partners, launched an ill-advised invasion of the Parthian Empire. He was trapped and slaughtered at the Battle of Carrhae, his head severed and used as a grisly prop in a Parthian play. With Crassus dead, the three-headed monster lost its balance. It was now a duel between two titans. The conservative Senate, sensing the rift, began to seduce Pompey back to their side. They played on his vanity and his growing fear of Caesar's immense power in Gaul. Slowly, Pompey allowed himself to be positioned as the champion of the Republic, the defender of the Constitution against the revolutionary threat of Caesar. The mechanisms of compromise had perished with Julia and Crassus. The Senate, led by hardliners who hated Caesar, pushed for a confrontation, demanding Caesar lay down his command. Pompey, believing his own legend and assured of his dominance, stood with the Senate, setting the stage for a civil war that neither man truly wanted. Yet neither could back down from without losing their honor. The moment of truth arrived in the freezing January of 49 BC. The Senate, with Pompey's tacit backing, issued the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, declaring Caesar an enemy of the state unless he disbanded his army and returned to Rome to face prosecution. Caesar, claiming he was defending his rights and the rights of the people, crossed the Rubicon River with a single legion, the 13th, casting the die of war. The news struck Rome like a thunderbolt. The city descended into absolute panic. Senators packed their bags, and the people looked to Pompey, their newly minted savior, expecting him to stamp his foot and raise legions from the earth as he had once famously boasted. But Pompey, looking at the strategic map with the cold, calculating eye of a veteran, realized the dire reality. His own loyal legions were stationed in Spain. The troops currently in Italy were raw recruits or men who had recently served under Caesar and could not be trusted. He could not hold Rome against Caesar's veterans. In a decision that was militarily sound but politically and psychologically devastating, Pompey ordered the total evacuation of Rome. He commanded the senators and magistrates to flee with him to Brandisium and then across the Adriatic to Greece. To the public, it looked like cowardice. The great Magnus was running away without striking a blow, abandoning the eternal city to the invader. Pompey knew that to win the war he had to sacrifice the city, utilizing the vast resources and client kings of the East to build an overwhelming force, but the psychological blow of seeing the defender of Rome flee the city left a stain on his reputation that he would never fully erase. In Greece, the two giants of Rome finally clashed near the city of Dyrrhachium in a campaign that showcased Pompey's lingering brilliance. While Caesar was daring and aggressive, Pompey was methodical and cautious. He used his superior naval power to cut off Caesar's supplies from Italy, slowly starving the Caesarian army, forcing Caesar's men to make bread out of roots to survive. He built a massive line of fortifications, effectively besieging the besiegers in a reverse siege. When Caesar attempted to break the deadlock with an assault on Pompey's lines, Pompey identified a weak point in Caesar's fortifications and launched a devastating counterattack. The Caesarian legions, usually invincible, crumbled. It was a rout. Caesar's soldiers were fleeing in panic, and the war was effectively won. Pompey had the opportunity to pursue the broken enemy and end the conflict right there on the beaches of Dyrrhachium. However, in a moment of fatal hesitation, Pompey halted his troops. He suspected a trap, unable to believe that the formidable Caesar could be defeated so easily. He did not order the final charge. Watching his army escape destruction, Caesar famously remarked, "Today the victory had been the enemy's, had there been anyone among them to gain it." This failure to commit, born of excessive caution and a fear of the unknown, allowed Caesar to regroup and retreat inland to Thessaly, giving the rebellion a second life that would prove fatal to the Republic. The final act of the tragedy played out on the hot, dusty plains of Pharsalus in August of 48 BC. Pompey had cornered Caesar again. His army outnumbered Caesar's nearly 2-1, comprising over 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry against Caesar's famished and exhausted 22,000 men. Pompey's strategy was sound. He would simply wait. He knew Caesar was out of supplies and would soon be forced to surrender or starve in the harvestless fields. However, Pompey was no longer the sole commander. He was surrounded by a gaggle of arrogant, bickering senators, the very men he was supposedly saving. They mocked his caution, calling him Agamemnon and King of Kings, implying he was dragging out the war to retain his command. They argued over whose priesthoods and estates they would take after the victory, dividing the spoils before the battle was won. Under this immense peer pressure, Pompey's will broke. Against his better judgment, he agreed to offer battle. His plan relied on his massive cavalry advantage to flank Caesar's right wing and roll up the line. But Caesar, anticipating this, had hidden a fourth line of infantry behind his cavalry, instructing them to use their javelins as spears and aim for the faces of the young aristocrats. Caesar knew that these vain young men, terrified of scarring their beautiful faces and ruining their future political careers, would flinch. When Pompey's horsemen charged, Caesar's infantry struck. The young Roman nobles, screaming in terror of the spear points, covered their eyes, broke rank, and fled. Witnessing his grand tactic fail and his flank collapse, Pompey did not ride out to rally his men. Something inside him shattered. He stripped off his general's insignia, mounted a horse, and rode away from the battle in a daze, leaving his leaderless army to be slaughtered or captured. This was a disgraceful, whimpering end to a glorious military career. From the master of the world, Pompey was transformed overnight into a homeless fugitive. He fled to the coast, sailing across the Mediterranean with his wife Cornelia and a handful of loyalists. It was a journey of humiliation. The cities that had once thrown open their gates to him now barred them. The client kings he had placed on their thrones refused to see him. He debated going to Parthia, but eventually decided on Egypt. The Ptolemaic kingdom was wealthy, independent, and owed its survival to Pompey, who had helped the current pharaoh's father restore his throne. He believed that the young King Ptolemy, the 13th, currently engaged in a civil war with his sister Cleopatra, would welcome him and provide a base to rebuild his forces. As his ship dropped anchor off the coast of Pelusium, he saw the Egyptian army gathered on the shore. A small fishing boat was sent out to greet him, carrying a few officials. It seemed a meager reception for Pompey the Great, but he rationalized it as a necessity of the shallow waters. He kissed Cornelia goodbye, telling her to wait, and stepped into the small boat, clutching a speech he had prepared in Greek to impress the young pharaoh. He was walking into a trap set not by warriors but by bureaucrats, the eunuch Pothinus, the rhetorician Theodotus, and the general Achilles, who had coldly decided that dead men do not bite and that murdering Pompey was the safest way to please Caesar. As the small boat approached the shoreline on September 28, 48 BC, ironically, Pompey's 58th birthday, a tense, heavy silence hung over the water. The heat was oppressive, and the only sound was the dipping of oars. Pompey recognized one of the men in the boat, a Roman centurion named Septimius, who had once served under him in the glorious campaigns against the pirates. "Surely I am not mistaken," Pompey said to him, attempting to bridge the gap with a smile. "You were once my comrade in arms." Septimius merely nodded, refusing to speak, his eyes cold and fixed on the middle distance, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword. The silence was the final warning. As Pompey stood up to disembark, reaching for the hand of a freedman on the shore, Septimius drew his sword and drove it into Pompey's back. Simultaneously, the Egyptian generals Achilles and Sabaeus drew their daggers. From the deck of the galley, Cornelia screamed as she watched her husband fall. Pompey did not fight back, nor did he beg for his life. In his final moments, he pulled his toga over his head to hide his face, preserving his dignity even as he was hacked to death. The assassins beheaded him, leaving his trunk to rot on the shoreline. A loyal freedman later washed the body and built a crude funeral pyre from the wreckage of an old fishing boat, a lonely and humble cremation for the man who had celebrated 3 triumphs and conquered the East. Days later, Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in hot pursuit. The Egyptians, eager to curry favor with the victor, presented him with a grisly gift: the severed head of Pompey pickled in brine to preserve it, and his signet ring. They expected a reward, perhaps gold or an alliance. Instead, Caesar recoiled in horror and disgust. He burst into tears. This was not the ending he had wanted. Despite their war, Pompey had been his friend, his son-in-law, and a fellow Roman of immense stature. To have him butchered by foreign mercenaries and eunuchs was an insult to the dignity of Rome itself. Caesar ordered the execution of the assassins and arranged for Pompey's ashes to be returned to Cornelia in Italy. The death of Pompey Magnus marked the definitive end of the Roman Republic. He was a man of immense talent, who rose too fast, a builder of empires who lacked the political ruthlessness to hold them, and a tragic figure who spent his life seeking the approval of an aristocracy that never truly accepted him until they needed him to die for them. In the end, he was the last great wall standing between the Republic and the Empire. And when he fell, the shadow of the Caesars covered the world.